I'm going to begin with a quote. Quote, "This is not considered a war crime if you had fun. Dogs of the regime, dawn is coming soon. Stop talking shit all the time. Fuck you, Ukrainian. I will burn foreign villages with a cheerful smile." Kharkiv, November 2022. So reads the graffiti that was left behind by occupying Russians, one of 650 inscriptions translated and verified by the Wall Evidence Project. And we're all too familiar with some of the atrocities that have come out from this. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin uses language such as special military operation, denazification, peacekeeping duties. Whilst claiming our plans are not to occupy Ukraine, we do not plan to impose ourselves on anyone. So I'm going to begin. My first question to Patty is this perhaps the greatest example of Orwellian doublespeak in recent history?
Sadly not, which is how common Orwellian doublespeak is, particularly in countries that we live in. But you know, obviously during wartime is a particular time when language gets abused and debased. In this particular instance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think it's a very interesting example of how history is both evoked and erased. And the fight against fascism, which is how Putin has kind of characterized this war, is very potent. One, because the World War II experience, I think, is very much more alive and present in Russia, perhaps, than it is certainly in the United States. And the continuity between that fight, which is what Putin is trying to do, and the fight today, as crazy as that is, given that Zelensky is Jewish and such. And the idea, too, of that we're not occupying Ukraine goes very much back to the idea, well, we can't occupy it because that land is in fact Russian. So by definition, therefore, we can't occupy it. By the same token, though, it's every, and I think we need to remember this, the good guys and the bad guys, every government in wartime. I was in Ukraine last year in Lviv, and I ended up going to this restaurant, which is a kind of theme restaurant of going back to the Ukrainian insurgency, which was essentially the arm that fought against both the Soviets and the Nazis for independence during World War II. Now, the thing is, on the one hand, you know, you had people kind of rousing and singing. There was the newscast of Zelensky in the background. But meanwhile, all of the signage and the history that they're talking about, in fact, goes to this Ukrainian military force, which was in fact massacred Poles and Jews and was very right-wing and engaged in ethnic cleansing. And in fact, we had reported how a lot of the kind of far-right, most extremist parts of kind of pre-war militias in Ukraine had become part of the military, and you could find these insignias on soldiers' uniforms of skull and crossbones, which was something that Nazi guards used in World War II, or the Black Sun, which was in Himmler's residence. And there came this thing, well, we don't want to draw attention to it because then you're, you know, basically falling into Putin's rhetoric and helping it. But yet if you don't call attention to it, are you essentially letting it continue and such? So it's on all of these sides that there's very difficult questions. I mean, the stories that we did about those went through a lot of layers of editing, a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion whether we should even run them for precisely those reasons.
Thank you. Iain, would you like to chime in here with something?
Yeah, I mean, it illustrates those quotes that you began with. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's fascinating that graffiti described Ukrainians as foreigners, because at the heart of what Putin is trying to do is this idea that, as Patty said, Ukrainians are not foreigners, because Ukraine is, according to Putin's view of history, Ukraine is part of Ukraine. I think it's worth understanding where that comes from and why it matters in the modern era, is that it's about cultural memory and the distortion of history. And Putin believes in an idea of a Russia that stretches back 1,000 years, and a Russia which is only properly, which has its roots in Kievan Rus and Belarus, and has some Viking origins as well, and a link to Byzantium. And through that, he then traces it to Ivan the Terrible, grandson of Ivan the Great, who consolidates and brings together Russia. Now, why does that matter now? Because he's using that history when he was locked up during the coronavirus pandemic. He was immersed in the Russian state archives and in deep, kind of almost fake versions of history, and came up with this, or it reinforced in his mind this idea of Russia as this great civilization which is put down by the West. And you see that post-Cold War, this idea that Russia has been disrespected. It's a great power, it's a great civilization. And that's actually really the heart of Sergei Rodchenko's brilliant new book on the Cold War. It's not really about Marxism, Leninism, a lot of the Soviet Union. It's about Russia as a great civilization. So if he can utilize those ideas, as he's done, then the Ukrainian war in his head makes sense. And then how does he explain that and convince other Russians? Well, he's very clever at using propaganda tools. You look at the Estonian hack of Putin's propaganda effort last year. So interesting how he's doing it, how these themes of Russian history, distorted history, are transmitted. They're transmitted through popular entertainment. They're transmitted through film and television. There's even a series made called GDR, which is about following the hero who is defending Eastern Germany against Western decadent civilization. And it is all in his head connected to an idea that Russia needs to be respected, which is also why he uses so much masculine imagery. We're all familiar with the images of Putin, hunting, shooting, fishing, wrestling a bear. Well, maybe not a bear, but certainly wrestling, and usually usually sort of striding through the wilderness with a rifle. What is that about? That is about saying Russia was humiliated at the end of the Cold War and has been humiliated by the West in his brain since then. Therefore, I'm going to construct this masculine narrative, transmit it through propaganda, and that then gives him the justification in his head for this appalling, brutal affront on a sovereign, independent nation, Ukraine. So it is his reading of it is very distorted. A lot of it is fake history, but there is in his brain there's a logic to it, and the propaganda is the end result of a deeply twisted historical thought process.
So a sort of follow-up point, a question would be, how do we, the consumers of media, how do we navigate this? When someone's so brazenly counterfactual, how do there's so many media outlets, conflicting ideas, not just coming from Russia, but also coming from within the West. How do we go about sort of navigating this and understanding?
Well, I guess one thing I would want to point out is that a lot of, and this is true in every country in terms of governments, a lot of what Putin is saying is for domestic consumption. He's creating a narrative and a story for his own population, and how that gets read out in the rest of the world sometimes is irrelevant, not all the time. And so as outsiders, and particularly outsiders, I don't speak Russian, so it's hard for me to kind of, as we know, language is so particular and immediate, which is why translation is difficult. So how we are both decoding not only what he says, but also, well, what's the intent? He's saying this for a reason for his own population, but then also what is he meaning generally? And I think, increasingly as we see, whether in our own politics, figuring out how to get at the truth of things. And one thing, obviously, I think, is looking at more than one source, and definitely putting things in context and understanding the history, as we've been talking about.
I think the key thing is specific point on on Russia, without getting too much into the geopolitics of it. But the key thing, I think, is to not fall for the myth, the constructed myth. There's a great, sadly now no longer with us, academic at LSE, Chris Coker, who had a great sort of shtick on how we should deal with Russia's attempts to bully us with a fake history. And it's to not fall for it. As he put, don't fall for the idea that just because so many of us have seen Dr. Zhivago, and you've seen the snow, and you've seen the myth of this enormous territory and its might and its glory, and that's what he wants. He wants respect for that and for the glory of Russian civilization. Is don't fall for it. You just have to be pragmatic and realistic about it. It's a political culture which does not respect weakness or even necessarily compromise in a lot of circumstances. What the West has to do, in my view, is be ultra realistic about it and prepare to defend ourselves. That doesn't mean necessarily conflict. That is defending ourselves to avoid conflict, ideally. That's the aim of deterrence. But at the heart of our confusion in the last 10 years, who is Putin? What does he want? How does he connect to Russian history? Is a Western naivety. It's a cliche now, but we've had a holiday from history. I mean, he becomes Russian leader on the final day of the century, the final day of the millennium. I think what that does in his head. I think of the imagery of that. And he's a guy from the KGB. And we spend, in our decadent Western way, 15 years debating whether or not he's our friend. Or, when the Brits we invite him to a state banquet at Buckingham Palace. The Americans fall over themselves to try and understand this guy and try and give him some of what he wants. And the reality is that what he wants, we can't give him, or we shouldn't give him. Not if we believe in Europe being free and Western civilization surviving.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you're both saying here. I mean, I think John Sweeney's book sort of depicts him as really a sort of street gangster, a street fighter, who's now sort of taken a myth of Russia and now is propagating that around the world. I think there's still this difficulty, though, still for the general public, is that looking at lots of sources, that's one way of doing it, but it feels that now we have to become researchers ourselves in order to decode everything that comes to us. Because I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems that people have lost faith, not just that they might doubt Russian propaganda, but they've lost faith in their own institutions, media institutions within the West. So they're not entirely sure whether or not what they're reading is factual.
Well, we used to agree on the facts broadly, right? We agreed on the definition of the facts, and then we disagreed about what to do about it, what the solutions were. But what's happened really rather quickly, I noticed it first in politics or in political journalism when Facebook really took off, is that people started to develop their own version of the facts. People would say, well, I'm not taking the mainstream media, I have my own friendship groups, and we have access to the real truth. And this of course illustrates there's the positive and the negative side of the creation of the internet, in that of course it's liberating, and of course mainstream media journalists like us were gatekeepers for a long period. Actually not as long as people imagine. It's actually, the modern media is relatively recent as a phenomenon. But we certainly saw ourselves as keepers of the flame, keepers of the truth, which is then transmitted to the public. So there's something positive about people saying, no, I can read my own things, I can find out from friends, I can share things, that's great. That's the positive side. The destructive side is that it just destroys trust completely in institutions, destroys trust in the media, and then in the politicians who relied on the media to transmit their message. So you now have a very, very unhappy situation, I mean, not least of which in the US.
I mean, I think just to add to that, so of course there's the echo chamber effect, where everybody is kind of reading their own and speaking to people who agree with them, and so they're not exposed to alternate views. Secondly, and I think it's interesting, I moved to London about 2.5 years ago to take this particular job. And one thing you notice, that I noticed immediately, is that for all of the differences, the BBC is still kind of recognized, even if there's criticisms of it, that it's too liberal or whatever, as a kind of, you know, respected source of information in terms of this reality that most people are willing to accept. That does not exist in the United States anymore, largely because of the rise of Fox News, which, although obviously the New York Times all the time gets accused of being liberal, but let's say we at least aspire to giving an unbiased viewpoint. And actually the laws in Britain are such that you couldn't actually have a Fox News there, although Rupert Murdoch tried to establish it because of the laws in terms of bias and equal airtime. The second thing to remember is that also in Europe, as opposed to the US, there is a tradition of an unbiased press, where I think in Europe there's much more, you have kind of the right-wing paper, the left-wing paper, the political view of news outlets are kind of accepted, and you kind of take it that you're getting a particular slant on it. But I think that is essentially the biggest problem, certainly in US politics today, which is there is no shared reality. And we have the government as much as certain, I hate to use the word media because, you know, there's a million different organizations that are outlets for news, but certainly some of them have become very corrupted.
Yeah, I think both of you raised some very interesting points. I'd like to pick up on this idea of gatekeeping. I think there's always, you know, I would agree with you. There seems to have been a loss of faith in gatekeepers, and there are one-time people sort of, and perhaps I mean I say that knowing at the same time there are people who believe the Daily Mail is, you know, their absolute faith in the gatekeepers there, and others will have absolute faith in the Guardian. But there is, I think, perhaps widely a sort of loss of faith in sort of gatekeeping. Not necessarily that they're lying about the facts, but just that they're only picking certain facts, that they are only giving you some of the facts of history and not necessarily all of the facts. And therefore it's not quite that it's deceitful in the sense of, oh, we're lying or we're changing the facts. It's just that we're just focusing on these facts and we're not bothering to talk about those. And I wonder how much that then sort of, you know, creates a sort of anxiety in people. They're thinking, oh, well, you've told me part of the story, but how much are you not still telling me? And therefore, that feeds into this general distrust.
Well, it's partly the obsession with truth. I mean, it's a really deep human need, isn't it? And it's very appealing, and it helps explain the rise of conspiracy theories on the internet. Conspiracy theories have been with us for a long time, but the way in which they can develop so fast is that there's something people like to demonstrate, that they knew something first, or that they knew the real truth, right? Okay, I can see how this story has been constructed to you know, to disguise what's really going on. And the reality is that 20 years ago, if you thought that, or if those were your beliefs, you had to sit at your kitchen table, write, usually in green ink, a letter to a news magazine or to a newspaper, right? You also then had to reread it and think, does that sound a bit crazy? You then had to go to the post box and put it in. And then it probably, if it arrived in a newspaper, like when I worked in newspapers 25, 30 years ago, most of those letters went in the bin, and a handful got published. Now, if you think that and you feel that, there's no editorial process between you and transmission. There's not even a delay. I mean, always, it's a good idea not to use social media and to drink at the same time, but lots of people do. But beyond that, people can transmit their rage, their fury, their anger at what someone has written, their conspiracy theory, like that, and then never have to recall it. And this is tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people doing it simultaneously with an algorithm algorithms created by the tech giants, which are, you know, like crack cocaine, designed to make this addictive, and then put in little computers in people's hands. I mean, and we are surprised by what's happened to us in the last 15 years? I mean, it's not, we shouldn't be surprised.
I mean, I was going to say that's absolutely true. You know, there's some positives to that. I mean, there was a certain arrogance, certainly, on the part of the media. The New Yorker for most of its lifetime, never even published letters to the editor. You know, they didn't care in other people's point of view. Even the op-ed pages, the opposite, the editorial page, is a relatively new invention in newspapers and such. And so I think, on the one hand, it is good to be very conscious of the way people are reading you, because the press does have a lot of power. And I'm, you know, and it's very humbling, you know, because an hour after you write something, I mean, every mistake I've made is kind of publicized to thousands or millions of people, and they're all than happy, more than happy to point it out to me if I do it, which is a, you know, cuts both ways. And to the other extent, you know, of course you're not getting the full truth. I mean, an average newspaper story is, what, 1,000 words, you know, 1,100 words. I mean, I'm selecting what I lead with, what the facts that I'm using. I'm hopefully in that small space trying to present as fair and accurate. And what I always say to people when they think I'm, you know, is that you may not like what I'm writing, but hopefully you will think I was both fair and accurate about it. And that's what we strive for. You know, sometimes we succeed better than others. But the other thing, though, I was just thinking when you're talking about social media and kind of, you know, not when you're drinking, it is interesting when people write things, they kind of forget there's a human being on the other side of it. So, you know, we get tons of love and hate mail. Generally, the hate mail is more than the love mail. But I try to respond to every person who writes to me personally as if it's not abusive, you know. And it's amazing how many times when you respond, and it's kind of, they realize there's an actual person on the other side and that you've read it, and they're immediately like, oh my goodness, thank you so much for responding. Now that you talk about it, I say, you know, that you, I mean, people want to be heard and to take it. I mean, that's a little bit off of this issues, but I
think it's a very interesting point, because I think it links us back to this, and this sort of came up in the last talk with Martin, this idea of there's the conscious inner life behind the language, and, you know, these things to talk about, you know, we can talk about later over lunch or something. You know, the one thing is, you know, the sort of vocal cords invading your mind, invading mind, but there's also this private life, this private imaginative life that holds these things and forgets these things and sees things and imagines things and jumps off. And perhaps, as you say, that when that's forgotten and it's just the sort of the language, then, you know, there's this sort of forgetfulness that there is actually, there's a soul or an inner life behind these words that also has, you know, feelings and such. I'd like to just go back to this language a little bit, this sort of, and ask you a little bit about, I mean, both of you are like wonderful journalists, and so you handle this and you deal with words every day. In 1946, George Orwell wrote The Politics in the English Language. It wouldn't be a symposium on language without mentioning that at some point. The decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. This is what he wrote in that thing, and he writes a whole pile of stuff which you may agree or not agree with as to, you know, the terrible state of the language in 1946. Our language has changed an awful lot now. We use things like emojis to sort of show emotions and things. People don't bother with a lot of punctuation anymore, sadly. How important is precision in language in terms of preserving truth?
I mean, it's an essential question, and I'm actually very interested in John McWhorter, what he will have to say about it later, because language is a living thing. You know, you can't, you know, you kind of want to sometimes preserve it, and Amber says, you know, this word means X, and you can't change that. It moves. I mean, I don't know that if people realize how much time and energy oftentimes, at least at a news organization like the Times, we spend on language. So for instance, it's at least a couple of decades now, the Times very rarely, I mean, you can find it, uses the word terrorism, particularly in relation to the Middle East. And the answer is because the word is so highly charged and has so much meaning that it was decided it was better to describe specifically what happens than use this word to describe it. The same thing came up after Abu Ghraib, the use of the word torture, because the US government was complaining that we and other organizations were using the word torture, and it did not fit the legal definition of torture. And so for a while, they used, harsh and extreme punishment. And then, in fact, the editor at the time wrote a note saying that, there is this legal definition, but there's a general understanding. Here's what has been going on. Here's what's been sanctioned, and we consider this torture. And now we're going to use that word. But as I said, you have the exact same language, and people interpret it very differently, those same words, whether it's to take offense or whether they think it's for something positive or negative.
But I think what Patty's describing there is a dying art, the written word, and that grieves me greatly. The sort of the beauty of the written word, the way in which it has to be, it's thought, and then there's that internal process of editing. Even a specific sentence, is that comma in the right place? Do I really mean to say that? You can overdo that, and journalism is about that process done at speed. So it's imperfect, but it's a fabulous human process, and we are instead becoming, and this is being videoed, we're becoming an audiovisual culture, and so much of the written word is going to be, to Martin's point earlier, in his really interesting talk, is going to be created by AI. So much of what we just think as service journalism or service information will be created, is already starting to be created. So the idea of vast newsrooms of feature writers and news writers generating that stuff, that'll all become much, much smaller. You think, or you tell yourself as an opinion writer, actually the opinion writers will probably be okay because we're providing something different, a point of difference, but then, people whose trades were eliminated in the first and second industrial revolutions thought that at the time, didn't they, right? And then, of course, some kind of artisan economy survived, but lots of people were swept away. So I think the written word, and then even a lot of audio and video, will be automatically generated, grazing on the existing internet. Now, that's going to make for a very, very different media landscape in the next 10, 20 years. And then you think back to the original point about propaganda, the potential for that to then be used by the next authoritarian or the next generation of authoritarian, or not even authoritarians, just conventional political leaders trying to persuade a population. I mean, will you end up with communities of artisan writers saying this is all produced by human beings? This magazine's made by people who actually read something called books. What a transgressive thought. Will that become a thing? I'm afraid I'm so cynical about public taste that I don't think that that's a great business model. I don't think there'll be much of that. A lesson of the last 15 years is that most people are content as consumers to kind of take what the machines produce and acknowledge that there are some terrible downsides, but they like Google Maps and they like all the stuff that comes with it, and WhatsApp and the ease of communication with their friends and family. That's the positive, and they worry less about the huge cultural shift. But in our business, it is if we think that the last 20 years have been about a wave of change, there's even more of it coming, unfortunately.
It seems, I mean, I take your point on this. I think there's a sense that I sort of hear sort of anecdotally that, AI is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting now, education needs to change, we don't need to do these things. But some of what you're both saying sort of makes me think that perhaps this may be true in terms of, organizing, structuring, content. But in terms of readership, in terms of readers, it's never been more important in terms of education. For people growing up to be absolutely clear about the precision and the meaning of words and the use of words and the ambiguities and the nuance in language, so that they are prepared for this potential onslaught.
But I want to go back to it. Something I meant to say before in terms of language and our understanding of language. And obviously there's kind of propaganda, government, collateral damage is really, what happens, people who are killed in wartime. I mean, there's obvious examples like that. But there's a lot that's so embedded in the language, and I was thinking about this. So for instance, I've written several times about tax reform. Now, anytime there is a change to the tax code, whether it's conservatives or liberals, and they're increasing taxes or they're reducing taxes, it's always tax reform, because reform has a positive connotation that you're doing it better as opposed to tax revision. And I kind of became aware of this, instead of using that term which everyone uses, a term free trade. Free trade sounds great. Who's against freedom? Without realizing what a lot of the meaning of free trade and the economic, consequences of that. And this goes again to how people understand language. I mean, I'm thinking of two examples very recently. So Black Lives Matter, which became a slogan in the US after a lot of police killings of blacks. And the response, the reactionary response to that was, well, all lives matter. Now, of course, who could be against the phrase all lives matter? It was actually a very shrewd counter, because the words themselves is all lives matter, and in fact was exactly what the proponents of Black Lives Matter were arguing in the first place, only saying, well, when you say all lives matter, you're not including blacks. Even more, contentious topic now, from the river to the sea. The words to many people mean the actual extermination of Israel, whereas to others are saying, no, that's not what it means. We're talking about liberation of a Palestinian state. So I think, you're talking about AI and how will we respond to that, but language today in everyday meaning has such an increasingly, I think, divisive interpretations of the same words, the same language. And that, I think, is feeding into this polarization, and a very destructive polarization. Because not only are we not talking about the same reality, we're not talking the same language, even if we're all speaking English.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.